Good day, Canada. UpLay here with another big picture. And today we are going all the way. Our longest broadcast to date, the full accounting. Because some stories deserve the time it takes to tell them properly. This will be a listen, and only a listen, no flashing images, so that you can just throw on a set of headphones and continue on with your day. Get caught up and enjoy your weekend. And through this, I am going to ask you for a few things. The first, if you've taken the time to listen to our broadcasts, please make sure that you subscribe to our YouTube channel or Yak Stack to follow our content, and make sure that you like the videos you genuinely like. This helps keep our content focused on what matters to you. The second, if you like the content we are producing, we rely on good people like you for support. We've added a donation button on UpLay.com, or if you prefer a monthly contribution, it's only $5 per month through a Yak Stack paid subscription. And lastly, share this content with your friends and neighbors. The only way to reset what we all know is going wrong is through the information that we're working to share. Now, this is the longest production we've made to date. In research and production, we've spent 38 hours, and all we're asking in return is for you to spend an hour of your time listening. Some of this may seem wordy. Some of it you may already know, some of it you will not completely agree with, but when you get to the end. We hope you realize why we've taken this time to break out today's special edition, Big Picture. Naheed Nenshi, the boy who cried wolf. Let's begin. There is a story most of us heard in grade school, and then promptly filed away under things that adults say to keep kids in line. A boy, a village, a hill where the sheep grazed every morning while the sun came up over the fields. The boy was the shepherd. That was his job. Sit on the hill. Watch the flock. Make sure nothing came out of the tree line to eat what the village depended on. It was not a glamorous job. It was not exciting. And one afternoon, maybe out of boredom, maybe out of some deep need to feel important for just a few minutes, maybe just because he was young and the afternoon was long and nothing was happening, he did something. He ran. He ran down that hill as fast as his legs would carry him, screaming at the top of his lungs that the wolf was coming. The wolf was here. The wolf was going to take the sheep. Everyone had to drop what they were doing and come right now. And the village came. Think about what that actually means for the people who live there. The farmer who left his plow sitting in the middle of a furrow. The woman who left her bread half-formed on the table. The shopkeeper who closed his stall and came running. The father who called his children inside and grabbed what passed for a weapon in that time and place. They came because they had to. Because the one time they did not, the one time they heard wolf and decided it was probably not real, the sheep were gone. And without the sheep, the village did not eat. The system only works if everyone takes it seriously. That is the nature of a warning system. The whole value of it depends on the signal meaning something. And there was no wolf, just a boy catching his breath, watching the chaos he had created settle back into embarrassed routine. He did it again. Different afternoon, same hill, same screaming, same village running, same relief giving way to the same frustration, and somewhere in there the first hint of something else, the first crack in the foundation. The third time, the wolf actually came. The boy was at the top of that hill, and he was screaming for real this time, real fear, real urgency, real danger moving through the grass at the edge of the tree line. He was screaming as loud as he had ever screamed in his young life, and the village heard him and kept working. Aesop wrote this story around 600 BC, 600 years before the birth of Christ, 2,600 years ago, and we are still living it. Not because human beings are stupid, not because we have not had enough time to learn the lesson, but because the same dynamic, the same mechanics of how trust works, how warning systems work, how a signal loses its function when it gets misused too many times, these do not change. They are built into how language functions in the human brain. They are built into how communities respond to repeated false alarms. The story is not just a lesson about honesty. It is a description of a specific failure mode that shows up everywhere human beings communicate urgency to each other. And it has been showing up in Alberta politics for the last 2 years in a way that I think deserves to be named clearly. But before I get there, I want to spend some time on the design of the thing itself. Because crisis language is not accidental. It is not something that just happens naturally. It is engineered. And once you understand how the engineering works, you start to see it everywhere, and you start to understand why some people cannot seem to stop using it even when it is clearly not working anymore. You know the street corner version. You have passed him at some point. He is standing in the middle of a city where everybody has somewhere to be and everyone is moving, and he is holding a cardboard sign or just standing there with his arms wide open, shouting about the end of the world. The end is near. The end is nigh. Maybe he smells a little like old garbage. Maybe he looks like he just woke up from a 30-year nap in the park, and this is where the morning led him. The details vary from city to city and decade to decade. The content never changes. What he is doing, what that shouting is designed to accomplish, is very specific. He is trying to get inside your nervous system before your thinking brain can catch up. Because those phrases are not informational statements, they do not convey data. They do not describe something specific that you can evaluate or verify or fact-check. What they do is trigger a response, a primal, automatic, pre-rational response that is older than language itself, the threat response. The survival alarm, the thing your nervous system does when it detects that something dangerous might be nearby, and it wants you to deal with that before you stop to think. The design of those phrases is to get that alarm fired off before your thinking brain can ask the obvious questions. Questions like, what specifically ends? When? On whose timeline? What evidence supports that prediction? How would we know if the crisis did not arrive? Those are good questions. They are the right questions. And the design of crisis language is to trigger the alarm before you can ask them. This design, this specific formula for manufacturing urgency, has been borrowed and refined across the full span of recorded history, not just by the crackpots on street corners, by governments, by religious movements, by advocacy organizations, by political careers built entirely on the premise that if you can keep people afraid enough, and if you can position yourself as the person who understands the danger and has the solution, you can lead them anywhere. It works. That is the honest truth of it. It works, right up until it stops working. The most extraordinary modern example of this, the most sustained, most consistently escalating use of crisis language in contemporary politics, is what has been done with the climate narrative over the last half-century. Now, I want to be precise about something before I go further down this road, because the usual response to any questioning of the climate crisis narrative is to immediately accuse the questioner of being anti-science or anti-environment. That is not what this is. Concern for the environment is reasonable. Stewardship of the land where you live is reasonable. Clean air is better than dirty air. Clean water is better than dirty water. These are not controversial positions. What I am talking about is what happens to crisis language when it gets applied to a topic continuously for 50 years without stopping. What happens to the words themselves when they never get to come down from the state of maximum alarm. Because here's the actual documented history. In the 1970s, this was already being treated as a crisis. Respected scientific publications were running articles about the coming ice age. Newsweek ran a piece in 1975 about how the Earth was cooling and what that was going to mean for food production, for weather patterns, for global civilization. The crisis was the freeze. Emergency action was needed. The planet was cooling, and governments needed to act immediately. Hold that, not to mock it. Hold it because of what comes next. By the 1980s, the alarm had shifted direction. Now the planet was warming. A different direction. Same urgency. Same language of emergency and imminent catastrophe. And there were specific predictions made in this era that deserve mention. Respected voices told us with great confidence that by certain dates the Arctic would be largely ice-free in summer, that coastal cities would be experiencing regular catastrophic flooding within decades, that specific ecosystems would be functionally gone by specific years. Some of those things happened to some degree. Many of the specific predictions, the ones delivered with the most confidence and the most urgency, did not materialize on the timelines described. The crisis did not go away when the specific predictions failed to arrive on schedule. The crisis adjusted, timelines were updated, new predictions replaced old ones. The emergency continued. Then, global warming as a label started to lose its urgency after decades of daily use. A couple of cold winters and people in the middle of the country were making jokes about global warming while shoveling their driveways in April. The label was developing a credibility problem with the people it most needed to reach. So it shifted to climate change. And I want to give genuine credit here from a purely rhetorical standpoint because this was a brilliant maneuver. Climate change is functionally unfalsifiable as a crisis. Cold winter, climate change. Hot summer, climate change. More rain, less rain, more storms, fewer storms, but bigger ones, climate change and climate change. Anything that happens in the weather anywhere on Earth can be cited as evidence of the crisis. You cannot falsify it because there is no weather event that counts as evidence against it. The label covers the entire range of possible outcomes and explains all of them in the same direction. And now, as of the last few years, we have the next escalation. Global boiling. That is not my phrase. That is the actual language now being used at international summits and in major media outlets around the world. A deliberate step up from warming, because apparently even warming had worn out after 4 decades of daily use and needed replacing with something with sharper edges. The narrative has shifted 4 times. The emergency has never stopped. Now here is the part of this conversation that does not get nearly enough airtime. When it is -30 on the Canadian plains, and if you have lived in this country, you know exactly what that feels like. The kind of cold that hurts when you breathe it in. Global boiling has a somewhat limited audience. When it gets that cold, the script does not disappear. It flexes. The framing moves from the planet is on fire to the climate is changing, because at least that one does not need explaining when there are 3 feet of snow on the ground in the middle of May. The label is always available. It covers everything. Cold is evidence of climate change. Warm is evidence of climate change. None of it can be counted against the crisis. The unfalsifiable emergency is, by design, permanent. They do not want to spend much time on the largest single factor in our seasonal temperature cycles, which is that enormous ball of nuclear fire 93 million miles away, and our variable proximity to it as we move through our orbit, and the roughly 11-year solar cycle that affects the amount of energy that ball of fire is putting out at any given point. This is not fringe science. This is basic solar physics. The sun affects our climate. The sun's activity varies. These are not controversial statements. They are just not convenient for the narrative. You cannot tax the sun. You cannot regulate it. You cannot build a political movement around demanding that the sun change its behavior. So the sun gets very little airtime in the crisis framework, even though it is the primary driver of the system everyone is so urgently discussing. What they do want to discuss is carbon dioxide. The molecule that plants convert into oxygen, the molecule that every human being and animal on Earth exhales with every breath, the molecule that has been present in the atmosphere for the entire history of life on this planet, and without which photosynthesis does not happen and the food chain collapses. They want you to be afraid of carbon, the element of life, and they want you to do your part by replacing your gas furnace with an electric heat pump, while the majority of what generates the electricity that runs that heat pump through a Canadian January is hydrocarbons, the same fossil fuels the whole exercise is supposed to be moving away from. The electricity grid that powers the clean energy transition is largely powered by the thing the clean energy transition is supposed to replace. This is not discussed much because it complicates the sales pitch considerably. They will not tell you that manufacturing a wind turbine from the extraction of the raw materials through to the fabrication of the finished product and its disposal at end of life takes more energy than that turbine can generate across its full operational life cycle. They will not tell you that wind turbine blades are not recyclable. There is currently no commercially viable technology that can break down a used wind turbine blade into something useful, so they go into the ground. Designated landfills where massive trenches are cut and the blades are buried. These are one of the first great products of the Green Revolution, and they will most likely outlive our species in those landfills. Not recyclable, not compostable, not biodegradable, not going anywhere, and they will not open the conversation about the scale of the rare earth mineral mining that goes into the batteries, the solar panels, and the electric motors that underpin the clean energy future they are advertising. Lithium mining in Chile's Atacama Desert, where extraction requires enormous volumes of water in one of the driest places on Earth, directly competing with indigenous communities and unique ecosystems for a resource that is already scarce. Cobalt mining in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where a significant portion of the world's cobalt supply comes from operations that human rights organizations have documented using child labor in conditions that cannot be described charitably. Copper. manganese, nickel, neodymium for the magnets in wind turbines, all of it requiring open pit mining at scales that make the environmental footprint of what they are replacing look tidy by comparison. The toxic waste ponds, the tailings, the rivers running colors they were not built to run, the land rendered unsuitable for generations after the mine is exhausted and the company has moved on. Compare that honestly to drilling a hole in the ground in northern Alberta and running a pipeline to carry what comes out. By any honest environmental impact accounting, from raw material extraction through end of life, the choice is not as obvious as the narrative suggests. But they will buy beachfront properties while telling you the coasts are flooding within your lifetime. And they will not explain why their personal investment portfolio reflects a fundamentally different risk calculation than the one they are asking you to make with your life and your economy. The crisis is real. The solution requires your sacrifice. The people telling you about the crisis are buying houses in Malibu. And that particular detail is not convenient. Now, I want to bring this home because the climate narrative is the century-scale demonstration of a specific dynamic, and that dynamic has a much more immediate, much more local expression that is directly relevant to every Albertan who is thinking about the next provincial election. But first, there is an old adage, and I am going to use it here because it is exactly right. If your only tool is a hammer, you approach every situation as if it were a nail. I want to be clear about something before I apply this, because I do not want to be misunderstood as saying that crisis language is inherently wrong, or that the words emergency and existential threat should never be used. They should be used. That is the point. Real emergencies exist. Real crises happen. Genuine existential threats, things that could actually destroy a community, an economy, a way of life, these are real. And when they arrive, the language of emergency is precisely the right language. It is not just appropriate. It is necessary. It is the only language that can cut through the noise of daily life and get enough people focused and moving fast enough to respond to something that genuinely requires everyone. The word emergency is a precision instrument. It is a scalpel. Use it to remove a tumor. And it is one of the most important tools in medicine. Use it to cut bread and open packages and pry off bottle caps and scrape paint off a windowsill, and eventually you have a piece of bent metal that does nothing particularly well. The words do not lose their meaning because they are bad words. They lose their meaning because they were treated as a general-purpose tool. Because the response they generated was so useful, the attention, the urgency, the mobilization, the political contrast with opponents who appeared unmoved by the alarm, that it became easier to reach for the hammer than to assess whether the situation actually required one, right up until the hammer stopped working. Naheed Nenshi was the mayor of Calgary for 11 years. And before I take this where you might be expecting me to take it, I want to give him something that honesty requires. In 2013, Calgary flooded. This was not a minor weather event. The Bow and Elbow rivers left their banks. Over 100,000 people were displaced. There was real danger, real loss, and a real need for a coordinated emergency response. Nenshi showed up. He declared a state of local emergency because a state of local emergency was precisely the right call. He was on the ground, he was communicating, he was visible. The response earned him broad national praise from people who agreed with almost nothing else he had ever done in office. When the opioid crisis hit Calgary, he stood in front of cameras and said people were dying and something had to be done. He was right. It was a crisis. People were dying. When COVID arrived in 2020, Calgary was the first major Canadian city to invoke its municipal emergency plan explicitly for the pandemic. He took it seriously. He pushed for faster provincial action. I am telling you this because it matters. He earned the credibility. He used the word emergency in moments that were demonstrably emergencies, that built up something real, a kind of trust that is genuinely hard to earn. He just did not realize how quickly he was going to spend it. Then he left the mayor's chair, spent some time outside formal politics, and in 2024, he won the leadership of Alberta's New Democrats. Now he is the opposition leader. A legitimate, necessary role. Hold the government accountable, shine a light on failures, give voice to Albertans who feel unrepresented by the party in power. That is the job. But he brought the hammer with him. And now, everything is a nail. In 2024, explaining his decision to run for NDP leader, Nenshi described the UCP as And these are his exact words: an existential crisis to the future of Alberta. Not bad governance, not policy disagreement. Existential crisis. January 2025, Trump tariffs announced. Nenshi calls it an existential threat to workers in Alberta and consumers. By April 2025, Canada itself is under an existential threat. Existential everything. 2025 running into 2026, the cost of living is a crisis. 1 in 3 Calgary households can't put food on the table. He says it repeatedly. Crisis. Act now. The UCP is failing you. And then the emergency rooms. January 2026, the Alberta NDP formally demands the UCP declare a state of emergency for the province's overcrowded emergency rooms. From Nenshi directly, we cannot wait another minute. Our lives depend on it. February 2026, more hospital press conferences. Legislature reconvene demands. Albertans are dying in emergency rooms. This is an unprecedented crisis. And then May of 2026, Alberta data breach. 3 million Albertans' data, names, addresses, voting records on a server they were never supposed to be on. Nenshi posts a video. This is not a drill. This is an emergency. Here we go. And then, just this week, the most extraordinary one yet, Nenshi accused Premier Danielle Smith of being a foreign agent of Saudi Arabia, said she would never receive a security clearance, said she was compromised. On the same day, she received her security clearance. Let that land. He called the sitting Premier of Alberta a foreign agent. On the exact same day, the process he said she would never pass came back clean. He was on to the next crisis before anyone had finished reading the headline. Picture this. It is a Tuesday morning. You are at your kitchen table. Coffee is on. Maybe the kids are getting ready for school. Maybe you are already half scrolling through your phone before the day properly starts. Your phone buzzes. Alberta data breach. 3 million Albertans. Your name, your address, your voting history. On a server you never agreed to. That is a legitimate concern. That actually matters. That is something you should be bothered by. But here's what happened in the 5 seconds before you process the details. Your brain did the thing it learned to do. It skipped straight past the content of the notification, past the details, past the actual question of whether your information was genuinely at risk. It went to a different question. Is Nenshi saying this one is real? And the second that thought landed, you got the feeling. Not panic, not urgency. Just here we go again. That is not cynicism. That is conditioning. Built precisely and incrementally over 2 years of emergency after crisis after existential threat by the same voice that spent 11 years earning the right to be heard in the first place. Now, before I move on, I want to take some time to give credit to the people who help keep on the lights and make the microphones hum for the big picture. Fresh and local. If you're looking for a place where Calgary's local food scene actually comes alive, Fresh and Local Markets and Kitchens at Avenida is where it's at. From fresh local produce to a lineup of brilliant chefs and rotating events, it's more than a market. It's a place to discover what your city can taste like when local businesses get the spotlight. And that's why you should subscribe and follow their upcoming events. Because every month brings something new. Seasonal features, family-friendly gatherings, food experiences, and the kind of community energy you just don't get from a big box store aisle. They don't go out of their way to feature their vendors, they're here to brag about them. And this is the confidence you need in today's market. Don't just pass by, stay connected. Subscribe, follow along, and keep an eye on what's coming next at Fresh and Local Markets and Kitchens. Visit them in person and subscribe to them online at freshandlocal.ca. Bring your family, bring your appetite, and bring your grocery basket. And now, back to our story. The boy who cried wolf was not a bad kid. He had a legitimate role in the village, a legitimate place on that hill. The first time he saw what might have been a shadow at the tree line, maybe it made sense. But the story was never really about the wolf. The story is about what the word costs every time it gets used wrong. Today we go through the full record, not the record he highlights at press conferences. The full record, 17 files. Starting from the beginning, File 1. Supervised consumption sites. Nenshi was one of the most prominent municipal voices in Canada calling for these facilities. He pushed for safe works at Calgary's drop-in center. He framed opposition as indifference to human life. The UCP was choosing death. Anyone asking questions was accused of wanting people to die. Here is what was already visible before he made that call. Edmonton had supervised consumption sites running, and Albertans living near those sites could see with their own eyes, not in a think tank report, What was happening in the surrounding neighborhoods? Crime was up. Encampments were growing. Residents and business owners were raising the alarm publicly and repeatedly. Nenshi saw the same evidence everyone else saw. He heard the same residents. He watched the same Edmonton neighborhoods. He pushed ahead anyway. Between 2017 and 2023, Calgary's broader community overdose death rate kept climbing. In the broader community, where the model was supposed to reduce overall harm over time, the numbers kept going up. There is a genuine policy debate about harm reduction versus recovery. Professionals who work in addiction treatment disagree about which approach produces better long-term outcomes. That debate deserves to be had. Nenshi's framing left no room for it. The science was settled. The UCP was choosing death. Anyone who raised questions about outcomes was accused of wanting people to die. He saw the Edmonton evidence. He heard the neighborhood residents. He pushed ahead anyway. The province is now stepping in to clean up the consequences of a model that showed its failures before it was ever brought to Calgary. He knew. He pushed ahead anyway. File 2. Identity politics is a political instrument. Naheed Nenshi has a phrase that has become a signature of his opposition leadership: punching down on the most vulnerable. He deploys it consistently around immigrants, around LGBTQ communities, around youth. It is designed to end conversations before they start. If the government is punching down on the most vulnerable, anyone asking questions about the policy is standing beside the puncher. The debate ends before it begins. When the UCP brought in protections for women's sport, ensuring that competitive categories remain categorized by biological sex, Nenshi called it punching down on the most vulnerable, an attack. Evidence of bigotry. The International Olympic Committee just did the same thing. Not Alberta, not the UCP. The International Olympic Committee, at the highest level of international sport, implemented eligibility frameworks for women's competition that aligned directly with what Nenshi called punching down on the most vulnerable. Nobody called the Olympics bigoted. Nobody held a press conference about the IOC attacking vulnerable communities. The same policy, applied at the international level, is simply called sport governance. The pattern is consistent. When the policy debate is framed as the UCP is motivated by hatred, the debate itself gets foreclosed. You cannot argue about competitive fairness in sport if the starting position is that one side wants to hurt people. The Albertans who see their genuine questions characterized as bigotry are not changing their minds. They are deciding that Nenshi is not speaking to them. The poll numbers reflect this. File 3. The book banning narrative. In 2023, Alberta school boards reviewed their library collections. Some books were removed from certain libraries. Others moved to more age-appropriate sections. Nenshi and the NDP deployed the phrase book banning consistently and forcefully across this entire period. Here is what book banning means. A government prohibits the existence or distribution of a specific work. The book cannot be published, sold, owned, or read. The books were not banned. They exist. They are in bookstores, in public libraries, on Amazon. What happened was a review of which books are available in publicly funded school libraries to students at specific grade levels. Now, I want you to think about something. Age-sensitive content restrictions have been a standard part of Canadian life for over 75 years. Ferris Bueller's Day Off came out in 1986, rated PG-13. If you were under 14, you could not see it when it opened unless you were with an adult guardian. And when it came to Blockbuster, if you were 12 years old and you walked up to the counter with that tape, the clerk sent you home. Nobody called Blockbuster a book banner. Nobody held a press conference about the existential threat to children's right to access information. Nobody accused the ratings board of fascism, because everyone understood instinctively, without needing it explained, that some content is appropriate for some ages and not for others. That is not censorship. That is the 75-year-old standard that every parent, every teacher, and every librarian in this country has operated under for the entirety of living memory. Nenshi took that standard and called it book banning. The books are still there. The standard is older than most of the parents in the room. File 4. The labor machine. To understand Nenshi's relationship with Alberta's labor movement, you need to understand who Gil McGowan is. Gil McGowan is the president of the Alberta Federation of Labor. The AFL primarily represents public sector workers, government employees, people whose salaries are paid by taxpayers. McGowan did not just support Nenshi's NDP leadership bid. He ran for it himself, not a donor, a candidate. He wanted the job Nenshi now holds, and when he did not get it, he went back to the AFL and kept the relationship exactly as it was. In 2025, McGowan publicly signaled his willingness to call a general strike, to use the collective power of public sector unions to topple an elected provincial government, not to negotiate a contract, not to resolve a specific dispute, to topple an elected government. The response from within the labor movement itself was telling. In December of 2025, IAFF Local 237, Calgary's firefighters union, quit the AFL. They called for McGowan to resign. Their stated reason was that the AFL had become too political. When the firefighters union tells you the political organization is too political, that is a signal worth paying attention to. And then there is the money. Calgary's Future is a third-party advertiser that operates in municipal elections. It is funded by taxpayer-employed union workers. In 2021, they spent $1.7 million on Calgary's civic election. In 2025, $576,000. Taxpayer-funded union workers. Buying municipal elections. In the city, Nenshi ran for 11 years. In 2025, 51,000 public school teachers went on strike for 3.5 weeks. 750,000 Alberta students were out of school. The union's stated justification was overcrowded classrooms and an underfunded system. The union failed at the bargaining table. The province held. Classes resumed. Nenshi stood with the unions throughout, because this is the machine that supports him, and the machine does not run for free. File 5. In 2023 and 2024, the Alberta government passed Bills 26, 27, and 29, adjusting how municipal governments and school boards relate to the provincial government. Changes to municipal elections administration, changes to education governance. Some of these provisions deserve scrutiny, some warranted challenge. These are legitimate things to examine. They got crisis framing instead. Every bill was authoritarian. Every governance adjustment was an attack on local democracy. Every change was an existential threat to democratic institutions. When you apply the word authoritarian to municipal election administration changes, the same word that applies to genuine democratic backsliding in Hungary or Belarus, the word stops doing its job. It stops being a warning. It starts being a noise. The bills deserve scrutiny. They got crisis framing instead. And Albertans watching were left with no ability to distinguish between the provisions that were genuinely concerning and the ones that were not, because every single one was declared an existential threat. File 6. During COVID, Nenshi became one of Alberta's most prominent voices for restrictions. Masking, distancing, limits on gatherings. He criticized the province publicly and repeatedly for not going far enough, not moving fast enough. The framing was always urgency. Our lives depend on it. Questions were raised about specific situations where Nenshi's personal behavior did not align with the public messaging he was delivering. He was not alone in this. Politicians from every party across Canada discovered that the rules they were asking others to follow were harder to apply to their own circumstances. This is a well-documented pattern in pandemic politics. We saw it coast to coast. But here is the specific cost for someone whose political authority rests entirely on crisis language. When the message is, our lives depend on it, and the messenger is found to be living differently than the crisis requires, the account takes a hit. Not because people expect perfection, because the gap between the urgency of the message and the behavior of the messenger makes the urgency harder to take seriously. You cannot credibly invoke a crisis you are not personally behaving as though is real. File 7. The media relationship. He is polling at 20% in Alberta. National media coverage tells a different story. CBC Alberta's coverage of Nenshi versus the UCP has been consistently asymmetric. His crisis declarations get amplified. The questions about whether the data supports the framing get fewer column inches. His characterization of UCP policies as racist, authoritarian, and dangerous gets covered as news. The counter-arguments and the full record get considerably less airtime. The CBC receives approximately $1 billion per year in direct parliamentary appropriation. Your tax dollars. Straight to the broadcaster. When a politician deploys crisis language that aligns with the outlet's institutional framing, the language does not get examined as critically as it should. A 52% majority of Canadians believe the CBC should receive less funding. More than half. Not a fringe position. The Conservatives ran on defunding the CBC in the last election. Canadians knew it was in the platform. The Liberals won. The taxpayer-funded media that spent the most energy opposing that commitment is still running, still funded, still producing the asymmetric coverage that keeps Nenshi's national profile alive while his provincial numbers collapse. The Albertan experience of this is simple. You hear the media framing. You live in Alberta. You see your own reality, and you learn to apply a discount to the amplification. The National Media Partnership does not make up for the lost credibility at home. File 8, Pembina, the oil and gas exodus, and what Carney promised. The Pembina Institute is a Calgary-based energy transition think tank whose goal is to end Alberta's dependence on oil and gas as quickly as possible. Nenshi has consistently aligned himself with Pembina's framework. He has cited their work. He has appeared at their events. He has oriented his energy policy arguments around their positions. Here is the context for that alignment. Over the last decade, $1 trillion in capital fled Canada. That is not a rounding error. That is the combined weight of a federal Liberal government, an NDP provincial government, and a policy environment built on the Pembina framework, all working in the same direction at the same time. Energy companies that had been headquartered in Calgary for decades, restructured, merged, relocated, or left entirely. The Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion tells the whole story in one sentence. The federal government had to buy it and build it themselves, because no private investor would touch it, because the political risk, the regulatory environment, and the sustained opposition from within the federal government's own policy framework made private capital impossible to attract. Ottawa spent billions of taxpayer dollars to complete a project the market would have built on its own, if the conditions had been created instead of destroyed. Mark Carney, the man Nenshi aligned himself with through the federal election, campaigned on promises of partnership with Alberta's energy sector, of getting projects built, of being a different kind of Liberal on the resource file. Alberta sent him 44 seats worth of skepticism in return, because Alberta has heard those promises before, from Trudeau, from every federal Liberal who needed Alberta's goodwill for 30 days and then got back to work. Alberta sends approximately $20,000 per family per year east through the equalization formula. Since 2007, Alberta's net contribution to federal finances totals $244 billion. We receive zero equalization in return. We fund the program that redistributes our wealth to provinces that then elect governments that vote against our pipelines and our economic future. Nenshi, aligned with Pembina, aligned with the federal Liberals, aligned with the framework that drove $1 trillion out of this province, now stands in opposition asking Albertans why they don't trust him on the economy. And then there is what happened inside Calgary itself. Over 11 years as mayor, Calgary's commercial property tax rate became one of the highest in Canada for major cities. Small businesses felt it directly. Storefronts went dark. The downtown vacancy rate climbed to levels that made Calgary's core one of the emptiest in any major Canadian city. He talks about economic failures in Alberta. The commercial tax trajectory that accumulated under his leadership is on that ledger, not the UCP's, his, File 9, the Opportunity Calgary Investment Fund. In 2018, under Nenshi's leadership, the City of Calgary established the Opportunity Calgary Investment Fund with $100 million of public money. The mandate was economic diversification, attracting technology companies to Calgary. The concept was reasonable, $100 million, public money. A big mandate. The very first recipient of OCIF funding was a company called Mob Squad, $1.5 million, the first check from a $100 million public fund. And who was behind Mob Squad? A man named Irfan Raji. But before we get to the check, there is a piece of context that belongs here. During his time as mayor, Nenshi was named as a defendant in a defamation lawsuit. He sought to have the City of Calgary indemnify him, to have Calgary taxpayers cover his legal defense costs. His argument was that the statements in question were made in his official capacity as mayor, so the city should pay. The courts did not agree. The ruling was clear. The statements were personal in nature. Nenshi would be paying his own legal costs. So he did what you do when you need money and you have a public profile. He set up a legal defense fund. He asked supporters to contribute. Among those who contributed to that fund was Irfan Raji. And then, before the OCIF funding decisions were finalized, Mob Squad became the very first recipient of $1.5 million of Calgary's public money. Here's the part that I want you to sit with for a moment. The city rejected the indemnification. Nenshi had to fund his own legal costs privately. The man who helped him do that received the first check from a $100 million public fund. It would have been cheaper for Calgarians to just pay the legal costs directly. He made it considerably more expensive. Give me something from my legal fund, and I will give you $1.5 million of Calgary's money. Mob Squad was presented as a technology company. The pitch was about connecting international talent with Canadian employers, growing Calgary's knowledge economy. What Mob Squad actually was a staffing agency, a company whose business model was placing foreign workers with Canadian employers, not a technology company, a staffing agency. And what did the public investment ultimately produce? The money went toward opening a coffee shop. $100 million of public money. The first recipient, a man who donated to his legal fund, $1.5 million. A staffing agency dressed as a tech company, and a coffee shop. When Nenshi talks about government accountability and transparency, the OCIF record is the other side of that conversation. File 10, the blame-shifting architecture. And the 10-to-1 number Nenshi does not want to discuss. Premier Danielle Smith put a specific number on the table. Nenshi's response to it tells you everything you need to know about how he handles inconvenient math. Guest workers in Alberta, temporary foreign workers, guests in our home, generate approximately $150 million in provincial revenue. They draw back over $1 billion in provincial services. 150 million in, 1 billion out, 10-to-1. Picture a Friday night at the movies. A family of 4 taps their card for $80. The family walking in right behind them at the same counter, same movie, same theater, taps their card for $8. Not a coupon, not a deal. $8. And the family that paid $80 did not know they were covering the difference. That is not a hypothetical. That is the math. And it shows up at every counter. 5 years ago, the word complexity was not a line item in Alberta's education budget. Today, the province spends $143 million on it. A word that did not exist as a budget category 5 years ago now costs more than $100 million every year. What complexity means when you strip the language off it. Classrooms in Alberta's major cities went from 30 children to 45. Those 15 additional children are the complexity. Children who grew up in countries where English is not spoken, who arrived here without it. They are not bad children. They are children caught in the middle of decisions made far above them. But 35% of the classroom complexity issues come from that population. 100% of the cost falls on everyone else. The families generating the complexity pay $1 for every 10 that the families in those classrooms have already paid into the system. Nearly 1 in 6 Alberta youth cannot find work. The entry-level positions that used to build a first paycheck and a work ethic, those jobs are occupied. The people in them pay $1 to the 10 that Alberta's young workers needed to get started in the province they grew up in. Houses in this province went up 50% in value in the same window that wages went up 10. An entire generation of Albertans does not believe they will ever own a home. The supply-demand imbalance that drove prices past what a starting wage can carry was driven primarily by the pace of federal immigration, far beyond what housing supply could absorb. Emergency rooms are documenting 18-hour wait times for basic triage. In documented cases, patients have died in waiting rooms before anyone could reach them. A system at capacity does not have room for everyone, and the room that is left follows the same math, 10-to-1. And then there is this number, $1 billion, spent by the federal government on health care services for people who do not qualify to immigrate here and are actively scheduled for deportation. Not permanent residents, not citizens, not people in the process of qualifying. People the system has already decided cannot stay, who are waiting to be removed. $1 billion for people being removed from the country, while 6 million Canadians cannot find a family doctor, while seniors who built this country wait months for basic diagnostic scans. Nenshi's response to the 10-to-1 data. Anyone raising these numbers is punching down on the most vulnerable. The debate closes before it opens. His response to the $1 billion in health care for people scheduled for deportation? Nothing. His response to the 33 million Canadians whose mobile devices the federal government tracked without their knowledge during lockdown? Nothing. There is a consistent pattern in how Nenshi frames national problems as provincial failures. Healthcare funding in Canada flows primarily from federal transfers to provinces. Those transfers have not kept pace with healthcare costs for decades. When Nenshi holds Danielle Smith responsible for Alberta's emergency rooms, the federal government's role in the funding structure receives very little attention in his framing. Federal immigration, federal housing finance rules, federal monetary policy, federal healthcare transfers. Nenshi's framing points at the provincial government. The federal government that controlled the actual policy levers receives considerably gentler treatment, because the federal government is not what he is trying to replace. Every national problem becomes a UCP failure. The federal government that built these conditions gets a pass. Alberta is watching this, and Alberta is drawing its own conclusions. File 11. The data breach double standard. Before we get to the elections Alberta breach, let me tell you about the actual largest data breach in Canadian history. The Public Health Agency of Canada tracked 33 million mobile devices during the COVID lockdown, without Canadians' knowledge, without their consent. Not a hack, not a third-party vendor error. The federal government deliberately, systematically collected location data from 33 million private Canadian devices to monitor whether people were complying with lockdown orders. The National Post reported it. The Public Health Agency confirmed it. 33 million Canadians. Federal government. No knowledge, no consent. Nenshi's response to the largest data breach in Canadian history. Nothing. No video. No emergency. No legislative demands. No CEO testimony. Complete silence. Then elections, Alberta disclosed that 3 million Albertans' information had been on a server operated by a third-party vendor that should not have had that access. Nenshi posted a video. This is not a drill. This is an emergency. Emergency legislative meeting demanded. CEO testimony demanded. He called it the largest data breach in Canadian history. It was not. The federal government had already conducted one more than 10 times larger, and he had nothing to say about it. Conspicuously silent for the record on the TELUS breach, the Loblaws breach, the Rogers breach. Those ones he did not seem to notice either. In February of 2018, the city of Calgary was hit by a ransomware attack. During his tenure as mayor, systems encrypted across multiple departments. Personal information of city employees potentially exposed. No video. No, not a drill. No emergency press conference. No demand for legislative hearings. An institution responding to an incident, the way institutions respond to incidents. Improper handling of information that should have been secured, both under a government body's management. The difference in how they were characterized has nothing to do with relative severity. It has everything to do with who was in charge when it happened. And here is the detail that completes the picture. After calling the elections Alberta voter list the largest data breach in Canadian history, Nenshi was found to be using that exact same voter list to text non-members about his anti-separation campaign. Breached. Data was in his own camp and being used inappropriately during a non-election period to push a narrative. There is not an election for 18 months from now. In his communication outreach, he mentions his For Alberta, For Canada anti-separation advocacy group. I will not judge him by his decision on wanting to remain as a part of Canada, but using election data to push this and absolving himself from it would be no different than if he signed up as an independent Amway dealer and did the same. It's not a campaign, and there isn't an election for another 18 months. The breach was an emergency when it was happening to someone else's government. The list was a tool when it was useful to his. File 12. The water mains. And what keeps happening? In June 2024, Calgary experienced a water main crisis. Multiple large-diameter mains failed within a short period. Over 1 million residents affected. Conservation orders for weeks. One of the most significant municipal water service failures in Canadian history. Nenshi appeared in media to frame it as a consequence of UCP underfunding. Naheed Nenshi was the mayor of Calgary from 2010 to 2021, 11 years. The mains that failed in 2024 were aging infrastructure built and maintained primarily during his mayoralty. He left office in 2021. The mains broke in 2024, 3 years into a different mayoralty. The infrastructure did not age in 3 years. But here is the part that the province is now investigating. During Nenshi's tenure, approximately $1 billion collected from Calgarians in utility maintenance fees, money paid specifically for the upkeep and renewal of the city's water infrastructure, had started to be diverted. Not spent on what it was collected for. Diverted $100 million per year, and Nenshi knew. He was aware the city was losing between 20 and 25% of its treated water through leaky, aging pipes. The problem was documented. He did not address it. The money was collected from Calgarians for maintenance. The maintenance was not done. The province has called for a full investigation. He stood in front of cameras after the 2024 crisis and pointed at the UCP. The money was collected on his watch. The 25% water loss was known on his watch. The investigation now underway is looking at decisions made on his watch. And then it happened again. December 30th, 2025. The Bearspaw South Feeder main, the pipe that supplies approximately 60% of Calgary's water, ruptured. The break sent a massive surge of water flooding the Trans-Canada Highway near Canada Olympic Park and 16th Avenue Northwest. Roads turned into fast-moving rivers of icy water in the middle of a Canadian winter. Emergency crews pulled 13 people from 8 vehicles overnight. Boats. Direct extractions. People escaping through sunroofs. New Year's Eve. 13 people rescued from their cars because a pipe that should have been replaced was not. Stage 4 water restrictions hit the city on January 1st, 2026. 16 days. Then March 9th. The same feeder main. Deteriorated pipe segments required a planned maintenance shutdown because after the December rupture there was still more deterioration to address. Still more deferred maintenance coming due. 24 days of Stage 4 restrictions. Nearly 2 million people this time. Every community that draws treated water from Calgary's system, all of them on Stage 4 restrictions because the pipe that carries 60% of the region's water had been allowed to fall apart. Restrictions lifted April 2nd. In 2026 alone, 40 to 41 days of Stage 4 water restrictions. Nearly 2 million Canadians affected. 2 separate events on the same pipe. Because the Bearspaw South Feeder main was allowed to deteriorate across a decade of deferred maintenance during the 11 years when the maintenance money was being collected from Calgarians and not spent on what it was collected for. 13 people pulled from vehicles on New Year's Eve. Nearly 2 million on restrictions through winter and into spring. 40 days of Stage 4 in a single year. This is not an infrastructure story. This is a negligence story. And the man who created the conditions for it is now standing at press conferences telling Albertans about accountability. File 13. Reconciliation language versus reconciliation outcomes. Naheed Nenshi uses reconciliation language effectively. In opposition, any UCP policy connected to Indigenous communities gets the full crisis treatment. The province is dismissing treaty rights. The province is ignoring community concerns. The province is failing on reconciliation. This language is powerful because the underlying issues are real. Indigenous communities across Alberta face genuine challenges. The history of government relationships with First Nations is genuinely difficult. These things are not in dispute. But here is his record as mayor of a city of over 1 million people for 11 years. Calgary has one of the higher rates of Indigenous homelessness among major Canadian cities. The overrepresentation of Indigenous people in the city's homeless population did not decrease during his tenure. The gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous housing and social outcomes in Calgary did not close under 11 years of his mayoralty. He is very good at the language of reconciliation. The outcomes for Indigenous people living in Calgary during his 11 years are a different conversation, one that rarely gets paired with his reconciliation rhetoric in the media coverage. When he deploys reconciliation crisis language against the UCP, the Indigenous homelessness numbers that accumulated under his own leadership belong in the same picture. File 14. What he did to City Hall. While Nenshi was mayor, he oversaw the implementation of a stricter code of conduct for elected officials at Calgary City Hall, a formalized bylaw, an integrity commissioner for oversight, investigations, and sanctions. On the surface, reasonable. In practice, Councilors from the more independent and conservative end of council found that bringing contentious items forward, challenging the mayor's positions, or using strong language in debate could trigger formal complaints to the Integrity Commissioner. Investigations. Public findings. Consequences. Councilors like Jeremy Farkas raised the alarm publicly. The code was being used not to prevent genuine harassment, but to create a chilling effect on dissent. To make it costly to challenge the agenda, Alberta's provincial government later moved to repeal such municipal codes province-wide. The stated reason, these codes were being misused to silence dissent in local government. Naheed Nenshi opposed the repeal. The man who built the mechanism that silenced Calgary City Hall now stands in front of cameras accusing others of attacking democratic institutions. He knows exactly what these tools do. He built one, File 15. Blanket rezoning and the sprawl crusade. The most controversial planning decision in Calgary's recent history did not come from nowhere. Nenshi spent his years as mayor laying the ideological groundwork for exactly this outcome. The vehicle was the word sprawl. Nenshi weaponized sprawl the way he weaponized every other crisis word. Suburban development was not just a land use preference. It was a moral failure. A subsidy to fat cat developers at the expense of taxpayers. He framed the cost gap between developer levies and off-site infrastructure as evidence that suburban families were getting a free ride on the backs of inner-city residents. Here is the problem with that framing. Developers already paid 100% of on-site costs. Local roads, sewers, utilities, all of it paid by development. The off-site gap reflected real infrastructure serving the whole city, not a secret handout. The sprawl subsidy was exaggerated at best, deliberately misleading at worst, and the consequences fell on the people Nenshi claimed to be protecting. The 2016 levy hikes increased upfront costs for new suburban homes. Those costs went directly to buyers. Entry-level homes, the ones first-time buyers and young families could actually afford, got more expensive. Not because of the market, because of the levies. Despite all the tough talk about ending sprawl, Calgary remained a low-density, car-oriented city. Infill targets under-delivered consistently. The policy raised costs and produced friction without producing the density it claimed to want, and the infrastructure irony completes it. The focus on new growth politics distracted from maintaining what already existed. The water mains that failed in 2024 were aging underneath a decade of sprawl politics. He demonized a normal Canadian aspiration, a yard, a house, space for kids to play. He called it morally inferior urban planning, and the people who wanted those things got the bill, File 16, the foreign agent accusation. We covered the government-funded Russia, amplifies separatism narrative on this broadcast. 3 government-subsidized outlets running the same story from the same government funded study on the same day the RCMP confirmed they found no evidence of foreign interference in the Alberta separatist movement. The RCMP finding ran behind a paywall. The Russia story ran everywhere. But Nenshi's personal contribution to the foreign interference narrative deserves its own file. He accused Premier Danielle Smith of being a foreign agent of Saudi Arabia. On the record, publicly, said she would never receive a security clearance, said her connections to Saudi interests made her a national security concern. The security clearance process returned its verdict on the same day. She received her clearance. The process worked. The result was clean. Nenshi moved on. No retraction, no acknowledgement, no accounting for having called the sitting Premier of Alberta a foreign agent on the exact same day the clearance process proved otherwise. CSIS has documented actual verified foreign interference in Canada for years. From India, from China, specific, in the annual reports, implicating real operations targeting real Canadian communities and real Canadian institutions. Those stories require accountability. They require difficult conversations with powerful trading partners. They require the federal government to answer for decisions that were actually made. Calling the Premier of Alberta a Saudi foreign agent requires none of that. It just requires a claim and a camera. File 17, the Olympic plebiscite. In 2018, the city of Calgary held a public plebiscite on hosting the 2026 Winter Olympics. Under Nenshi's leadership, the city spent $16 million of public money running the bid process. The yes side had over $1 million to campaign. The no side, the Calgarians who simply thought this was not the right call at this moment, had $10. $10. Calgarians voted Nenshi accepted the result. He called the process democracy. Now he is calling Alberta's upcoming separation referendum a farce. He says it will cost $45 to $50 million. He launched Alberta for Canada to oppose it. He said the question is probably unconstitutional. He said the Premier will ignore the results anyway. And in the same press conference, he asked Albertans to go vote. $16 million of public money. Yes side over $1 million. No side $10. He called it democracy. $45 to $50 million. A province-wide vote on the most consequential political question Albertans have faced in a generation. He calls it a farce. The position on democratic exercises is not about the principle. It is about who is winning. And there is one more item from that press conference worth noting here. Nenshi and his co-presenter Pencholi were asked about the Forever Canada petition, the one they called the largest in Canadian history. Nenshi said it was the largest petition in Canadian history. Pencholi said 2 minutes later it was the largest in Alberta history, second largest in Canada. Same podium, same petition. Two completely different facts about it. These are the people demanding higher standards from everyone else. And then there is Bill 206. Nenshi pushed a direct copy of Ontario's Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act, the AODIA, introduced in that province in 2005. A 20-year-old Ontario framework presented as innovation for Alberta. Ontario's 2025 deadline for full accessibility compliance under that same legislation came and went. Two independent reviews characterized the progress as glacial, the outcome as unequivocal failure. 20 years, glacial progress. Unequivocal failure. Nenshi's solution for Alberta was to copy it. The crisis language was the same. The scrutiny of what was being copied was nowhere to be found. That is the 17 files. And now, just a quick word about one of the companies helping to keep the lights on at the UpLay show. If you want to wear your values without saying a word, then Alberta Tea has you covered. This is homegrown Alberta-style clean designs, bold messages, and shirts that say you know exactly where you stand. Aaron has been kind enough to offer a full 10% off to Haver UpLay listeners. When you place your order, enter in Haver10 into the discount codes, Haver, all capitals followed by the number 10. Minimum quantities in effect for custom orders. Contact Aaron for more information. In a world full of noise, your clothing should do more than just fit. It should speak, it should stand for something, it should tell people you're proud of Alberta, proud of the West, and not afraid to show it. So if you're looking for tees that carry a little attitude, a little identity, and a whole lot of Alberta grit, check out Alberta Tees at abteeco.com. Back to our story. Before the big picture, let me remind you of where we started, and where we should always start when honesty is the standard. The 2013 flood response was genuine credit. He earned it. It is on the ledger. The opioid work was genuine credit. He was right that it was a crisis. It is on the ledger. The COVID call was genuine credit. First major Canadian city. He showed up. It is on the ledger. These things are real. They belong in the account. And then there is the other side of the ledger. The supervised consumption sites, where he saw the Edmonton evidence, heard the neighbors, and pushed ahead anyway while the province now cleans up the consequences. The punching down framing, where the International Olympic Committee just did the thing he called bigotry, and nobody called the IOC a hate group. The book banning narrative, where a 75-year-old standard for age-appropriate content became fascism when applied to school libraries. The labor machine, Gil McGowan running for the leadership he now holds, signaling general strikes against elected governments, firefighters quitting the AFL for being too political, taxpayer-funded union workers buying municipal elections in the city he ran for 11 years. Bills 26, 27, and 29, where governance adjustments became existential threats to democracy without examining which specific provisions were actually worth challenging. The COVID period, where the rules for thee and the rules for the messenger were not always running at the same standard. The media relationship, where $1 billion taxpayer dollars a year to the CBC produces asymmetric coverage and national amplification without provincial credibility to back it up. The Pembina alignment and the $1 trillion that left Alberta while he aligned himself with the framework that made it happen. The OCIF accountability gap, $100 million of public money. The courts ruled he had to pay his own legal costs. A legal fund was set up. The man who donated to that fund received the first check, $1.5 million to a staffing agency dressed as a tech company and a coffee shop. The blame architecture, federal failures attributed to the provincial government week after week, while the 10-to-1 math ran quietly in the background and the $1 billion spent on health care for people scheduled for deportation passed without a word from him. The data breach double standard, the Public Health Agency of Canada tracked 33 million Canadians' mobile devices during lockdown without knowledge or consent. The actual largest data breach in Canadian history. Complete silence from Nenshi. Then, Elections Alberta had a 3 million person breach, and it was not a drill. And then he used that same voter list to run his own campaign. The water mains, hundreds of millions of dollars in maintenance fees diverted, a 25% water loss he knew about and did not address, the pipe that carries 60% of Calgary's water rupturing on New Year's Eve and putting 13 people in fast-moving icy water on the Trans-Canada Highway, nearly 2 million Canadians on Stage 4 restrictions in 2026, 40 days of restrictions across 2 events on the same feeder main, and then standing in front of cameras pointing at the people who have been managing the system for 3 years. The reconciliation language and the Indigenous homelessness numbers that accumulated underneath it for 11 years without closing. The code of conduct, the mechanism he built to silence dissent at City Hall, and then his opposition to repealing it when the province called it what it was. The sprawl crusade, the levy hikes that raised costs for young families and demonized the aspiration of a yard and a driveway as morally inferior urban planning, while the infrastructure underneath the city went unmaintained. The foreign agent accusation calling the Premier of Alberta compromised by Saudi Arabia on the same day her security clearance came back clean. The Olympic plebiscite, $16 million of public money, yes side over $1 million, no side $10, he called it democracy. The separation referendum he calls a farce. 2 people at the same podium who could not agree on whether their own petition was the largest in Canada or second largest in Canada. And Bill 206, copying Ontario's 20-year accessibility failure and presenting it as a solution for Alberta. Here is what the full ledger tells us. A leader who deploys crisis language on everything eventually teaches the people listening to filter it. Not because they stop caring about real emergencies, because the signal and the noise become indistinguishable. The brain routes the alarm through the pattern recognition circuit, the one that says, here we go again. There is a poll out of Alberta right now. He has slipped further than his predecessor at her worst polling. Rachel Notley, who presided over a party that got thumped in 2023, was polling higher at her lowest point than Nenshi is polling today. Let that land. He came in with genuine goodwill, name recognition that most politicians spend entire careers trying to build, 11 years as Calgary's mayor. National credibility, real crisis management on his record. He had every advantage. And he is underperforming the worst version of his predecessor. There is a direct line from that poll number to the boy on the hill. When you tell Albertans the UCP is an existential crisis and the province keeps functioning, the crisis did not come. When you call tariffs an existential threat and life continues, the threat did not arrive as advertised. When you demand a state of emergency for the ERs and the legislature breaks for Christmas recess, the emergency apparently was not that existential after all. When you call the Premier a foreign agent and her clearance comes back clean the same day, the accusation landed exactly nowhere. We keep surviving his existential crises. And every time we do, it costs him something he cannot buy back. The most powerful words are the ones used most rarely. That is not a sentiment. That is how language works. Emergency carries weight because we reserve it for emergencies. The second you apply it to everything, the government you don't like, the tariffs you oppose, the policy disagreement of the week, the premier you'd like to be, you have turned a precision instrument into a sound effect. Now, here is why this matters beyond Naheed Nenshi's personal political career. Alberta needs an effective opposition, not because the UCP is governing perfectly. They are not. Not because Danielle Smith is always right. She is not. But because a democracy functions better when the people holding power face genuine, credible, sustained pressure from the people opposing them. When the opposition leader has spent his language account to zero, when Albertans hear emergency in his voice and route it through the here we go again circuit, the government gets less scrutiny. not more, less. That is a loss for everyone in this province, including the people who vote NDP, including the people who genuinely want better health care and better affordability and a more accountable government. They deserve an opposition leader whose credibility is intact when the real fight comes. The village heard the boy crying wolf. They ran the first time. They ran the second time. The third time they had things to do. So here's what I want to leave you with. If the real emergency shows up in Alberta, if there's a genuine crisis requiring genuine coordinated response where actual lives are actually at stake, how many Albertans are going to see Naheed Nenshi's name on that notification and keep scrolling? And at what point does a leader who has built his entire platform on fear and urgency and our lives depend on it begin to understand that the platform itself is the reason the platform is failing? That is not the legacy Nenshi built as mayor. That is what he is building now. And now you see the big picture. Thank you for taking some time to sit through this all, and remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel, Haver UpLay. Throw us a like, and if you can, help support the channel through a donation at haveruplay.com or become a paid subscriber at Yakstack. Have an amazing weekend and a happy Mother's Day to all of the moms listening. Haver UpLay, signing out.